Join us for a two-part interview with Nic Marks, a Cambridge-educated statistician and founder of Friday Pulse, a company that tracks our happiness at work and helps us understand how happiness, productivity, and profitability go hand in hand. Trust me, it'll put a smile on your face.
But it's absolutely clear that when people are happy at work, they work better. And that's very, very clear from all the research and all the data I have. So there's definitely a win-win in here. And people certainly don't want to be miserable at work. And I think there is a lot of unhappiness at work and there is a lot of misery. And ultimately, miserable people do miserable work.
Okay, let's get into this. Think back to when you were starting out. You're willing to work hard, you tried your best in school, maybe went to university and dreamt about the possibilities of what your future might hold. So if the average person spends 90,000 hours at work in their lifetime, are you on track to look back and feel happy? Hopefully, you're different than 85% of people who, according to a survey by the Gallup organization, aren't engaged in the work they do and don't know how to be happy in what they accomplish in their careers. And that's where our guest today comes in, Nic Marks, founder of Friday Pulse, a UK-based business. Nic started life in applied statistics, eventually landing as an advisor to the Tony Blair and David Cameron governments, focusing on how to measure happiness in society. He felt governments were measuring the progress of life wrong, as so much of what we commit ourselves to every day is the work we do. So he set out to help businesses measure happiness more effectively. You might not be surprised to discover that the happier people are, the harder they work and better they do. But Nic explains that while companies often like to equate themselves with high-performance sports teams, they often fail to realize that a big part of athlete performance is embedded in balancing stress with recuperation. Hard to achieve when you're still replying to emails late at night. It seems that the younger and older generations are happier than those in the middle. In fact, happiness dips at age 42, the very peak of our experience, energy, and earning years. For many, they're 20 years into their career. No surprise then that people ask themselves, is this all there is? Well, smart companies are trying hard to answer that. According to a survey of 12,000 people, those who are able to find happiness in the very careers that occupy so much of our focus report almost 2 times greater job satisfaction, are 1.5 times more engaged, and are 3 times more likely to remain with their current employer. Performance goals that mean greater happiness for the individual and a better performance for the business. Nic will share with us his journey towards creating Friday Pulse and what happiness might mean to all of us as we lead teams, manage businesses, or simply seek to sleep better at night. Now, over to Nic. So I'm very, very excited today to welcome Nic Marks, who is the CEO and founder of a really interesting company called Friday Pulse, based out of London in the UK. And we're here to hear about the role of happiness in business performance. So Nic, I just want to say welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for asking me, Robert.
So Nic, the first question I've got is tell us about Friday Pulse and exactly what it does, what it contributes to other businesses.
So at Friday Pulse, we basically on a Friday ask people how their week was. So I'm a statistician and an expert in happiness, or so-called expert. I've been doing it a long time, so I suppose it makes me an expert. And we basically look after team happiness and team culture for organizations. And we do that by asking on a Friday, how was people's week? We do that statistically by asking them how happy they were last week. And we also do that qualitatively by asking people to say what's a success for them, anyone they want to thank, any frustrations. So we basically collect a bit of qualitative data too, and we feed that back. So basically we're a statistical feedback loop. As well as that Friday Pulse, we also once every 90 days, once every quarter, we ask people deeper dive questions into the drivers of happiness. So we're basically like a zero accounting package, but for happiness at work.
Now, when you just out of curiosity, when you ask the question, when ask people to comment on their relative level of happiness, how much of that is linked to their work versus their home life, or is there a distinction?
I mean, there is. We frame it as how happy were you? Well, how did you feel at work this week? So we ask about at work, but of course there is bleed between home and life. If you are a positive, happy person, you're likely to bring that to work. If you get stressed at work, you'll take that home. So there's always crossover between it. But we're basically asking people about their experience at work.
Right, right. So tell us a bit about your background. Like, how did you get into the happiness business or the measurement of happiness business?
So I've always been a math geek. I was the guy at school that was really annoying that could come top of maths without doing much work. And then I went to Cambridge to read mathematics, and I actually discovered I wasn't a mathematician. I was an applied statistician. And I got into health statistics and quality of life and simulation modeling, queuing theory, and all sorts of things like that. And then when I left uni, I did a few jobs, but then eventually I started to settle into the policy world. And how did you measure quality of life in the UK? And I became an advisor to the Tony Blair government and then the David Cameron government on how you measure well-being. And that was sort of a first career, or maybe a second one. And then after I did a TED talk in 2010 about my work about policy, I then decided it was an opportunity to do something different, and I decided to focus on work. So I founded what has become Friday Pulse about 9 years ago.
So what was the gap or the opportunities you saw? Like, why focus here?
In my sort of youth and my sort of optimistic youth, I felt governments were measuring progress, experience of life wrong. And I'm just as critical about how businesses do it. And I thought, okay, we can have something to say to businesses about how they measure their people's experience of work. And that was the aim of, it was firstly called Happiness Works, my company, but we changed the name about 4 years ago. And that was the founding of Happiness Works, was we thought we could offer something about how to measure employee experience. And it has evolved over time into what's now Friday Pulse.
Interesting. Now, I'm curious, before I dive into what I would imagine are the obvious challenges of getting companies to understand the importance of happiness, I'm just curious, as I was thinking about your business, as I was researching it, I was thinking, do people go into work? Do people enter the workforce? Do they train to go into the workforce thinking that happiness should be a big part of what they get out of it?
I don't think so. I think most people go to work because we need it for the structure of our life and for money and things. But it's absolutely clear that when people are happy at work, they work better. And that's very, very clear from all the research and all the data I have. So there's definitely a win-win in here. And people certainly don't want to be miserable at work. And I think there is a lot of unhappiness at work, and there is a lot of misery. And ultimately, miserable people do miserable work. So, there's a win-win in the middle of this. So that's really what we're going for. So, I mean, though, having said that, work and my career is a large part of my happiness. It is the space in my life where I really contribute to society. So there is something that can be, not always, but is the possibility to be quite glorious about work.
There is something interesting. I'm guessing that we're of a similar vintage. And when I think back to my father's generation, my father was, kind of a working class guy. My general sense of what work was like then was, at the end of the day, you hung up your mailbag, or you hung up, you put your work away, for a lot of people, and the day was over, and then you're on to family life. Today, it seems like work is all encompassing. Like, I'm blown away by the number of people that just seem to never disconnect. Obviously my accent, you can tell I'm in North America. This obsession and almost one-upmanship that takes place around not taking holiday and always being connected and seeing everything as basically mission critical has just seemed to suck the life and the sense of purpose out of a lot of the people I meet. Like, I don't meet a lot of people, certainly at a professional level, that seem anything but stressed out. And I'm wondering, what your observations are over time. Like, has there been a generational shift? And out of curiosity, what percentage of professionals are happy today?
Okay, quite a few questions in there. So I think that certainly from Europe, we think you're kind of crazy in the States about how little holiday you have, how little maternity, paternity cover you have. We have prioritized leisure more than you have in North America. And I wouldn't want to have whatever it is. How much holiday people typically have? 2 weeks a year, 3 weeks a year, something like
2 weeks, yeah, and a
that. Yeah,
significant percentage don't take all of it.
yeah. So in the UK, I think the minimum is 20 days plus public holidays, so basically 4 weeks. But quite a lot of people have 30 days holiday a year, so 6 weeks. So we're somewhere in that space between 4 and 6 weeks, and I think quite a lot of people would choose leisure over more pay if you gave them the option, as long as their career prospects were kept steady. So I think you've got to there's must be more of an issue with burnout and busyness in the US than there is in the UK and Europe, but there's still a lot of busyness here. I mean, obviously we have technology which sort of is 24/7 now, and I think we probably will need to protect ourselves from that increasingly as time goes on, because we're becoming hyper connected and always on, and that is not healthy for us. Often people use a sports analogy for business and say we want to be a high performing team, whatever. We forget that sports people spend a lot of time resting, spend a lot of time recuperating. That's a lot of time for renewal, and we don't really allow much of that for business. And I think that's a mistake. And I think the younger generation are starting to demand that more. They're looking for experience more. I mean, my focus is more on the UK, so I know more of the data in the UK, but certainly in younger people always hop jobs more. We did when we were younger, but everybody is moving jobs more, and the young even more than we did when we were young. But it's a whole shift across the whole spectrum, people moving jobs more. But I think people are demanding good experience at work more. So this is becoming an increasing issue for organizations.
Now, do you notice in the data, do you see any generational differences?
Yes. So we typically, this is pre-COVID, we typically see a U-shaped curve of happiness, i.e. the young are happier than the middle-aged and the older are happier than the middle-aged. So basically life dips approximately age 42. And in a way, it's a sort of clash between, you tend to be in your early 40s, you tend to have young dependent children, you might have older dependent parents as well. The size of your mortgage and debt has got quite big. You realize you're not going to be a professional sportsman if you're mad like sports. You realize that some of your dreams are not happening. And so there's a little bit of a sort of dip there. So that's the typical thing we see. We see that in work data as well as general life data. So there are some differences. But having said that, during COVID, during the pandemic, the young have been particularly under pressure. So we actually, in the UK and Europe, we now have almost a straight line, i.e. the young are the least happy, then the middle-aged and the elder. I'm sure that's a temporary blip, but that's what's happening at the moment.
Oh God, I could talk to you about this all day, because I'm curious about, again, this is purely observational, but, I think about the pressure. We moved back from London last year after 13 years there. And to be honest with you, I was played a senior role in a large company. Felt very much like a North American company to me. It was a global business. Maybe that was part of the factor. But part of what I observed is that there's issues of status, there's issues of where you live, there's issues of where you come from. There's issues of gender. And I'm wondering, when you delve into the data, are you able to kind of establish whether some of those issues are real in the way that people feel about happiness at work?
There are differences between genders, not particularly at the overall happiness level, but particularly at things like autonomy or work-life balance, relationships. So females tend to report stronger relationships at work. Males tend to report stronger sense of autonomy at work. And so we see some differences, but not particularly in overall happiness. They're relatively level. I don't know enough about the data to be able to say. I mean, I do know the data, like general happiness data, that there's a social gradient to happiness, like we see in most variables. So, people from poorer backgrounds are less happy than people from richer. We see that people who live in rural areas are happier than those that live in cities. So actually you find that London is the least happy region in the UK. because it's the most densely populated. And when you have density of population, you have more potential for, you have less peace, you have less quiet, you have less green space, you have less time to yourself, you have more potential for conflict, less access to nature, those sort of things. So you definitely find people who live in cities tend to be more stressed and less happy than those who live in rural areas.
Is there a difference between in happiness between a large company and a small company?
Yeah, smaller companies are happier.
Are they really?
And mainly driven by autonomy, in that the people can shape their work more. But all the variables I measure tend to drop larger organizations, apart from things like career development, or some learning things that are good in larger ones. But relationships tend to be slightly down. But the main one that is down is ability to shape your work. Sometimes a sense of belonging, those ones are slightly lower, but definitely smaller companies. So when you see something like Google's the happiest place to work, I always think, well, that's not true. It's going to be some small 10, 15 person company that's passionate, everyone gets on, they've got real strong team flow. They'd be much happier than in a large organization.
Yeah, instinctively that seems right to me, because I'm dying to dive into this question, because to me it seems like a bit of a no-brainer that if you've got a team that feels a strong sense of purpose and happiness with the people they work with, the work that they do, and the direction that they're trying to go in as a team, it feels to me like that team is going to produce better results. But to be honest with you, somebody who's worked with a lot of very big companies, I feel that there's a lot of lip service paid to the importance of happiness in the workplace. I'm curious, what do you see out there? It just seems like a motherhood issue. Of course, you want your team to be happy, but how much are companies really paying attention to some of the pressures that are created within their cultures and the fact that they need to do something about it if they want to create a happier workforce?
I think the vast majority avoid it, and I think they were worried about opening a Pandora's box. They're worried that if they start asking this question, they're going to find a lot of unhappiness, which actually they even if they did, it'd be better they knew about it. But in most cases, they'd probably find a lot of okayness rather than total unhappiness. And of course, okay isn't really okay. It's you haven't got people really enthusiastic if they're only okay, but they're not totally disengaged either. So that's what we tend to find. I think people get worried about measuring happiness because they're worried, one, what they find, but they're worried whether they'll be able to address it. And of course, that's what we try and help, is by saying, well, if you measure regularly, you pay attention to it, you basically start signaling that it matters, you start bringing those conversations into the workplace. And happiness at work is really a habit. It's like, do you talk about it every week? Does the team start noticing how they feel? Because we are feeling creatures. Humans are feeling creatures. Feelings come before cognition. We feel before we rationally understand things. So if you get people's feelings right, the cognition and the rationality, the logic will all flow from that.
A friend of mine who was a fine artist ended up spending about 6 months on jury duty in London, and as a professional fine artist, she's a teacher at the Royal College of Art. Her life it's quite different, her life, than a lot of the people that I generally know in professional circle. And so she did this 6-month jury duty, and she was describing how she would come out of the underground at London Bridge, and she was always blown away. She's described these gray people in their gray suits marching into the office towers. And it was so funny because it was like, that is my impression of people when I witnessed them going, like drones into these office towers. And when I imagine the idea of happiness in the workplace, I think a lot of the people that control the levers of dictating whether we should prioritize happiness in the workplace are themselves not really focused on happiness. Like executive leadership in a lot of publicly traded companies that are focused on share price are not really thinking about, well, let's think about this. What kind of environment are we creating? Because it's not a factor within their own lives. So I'm curious if there is a connection between, leadership or a CEO that actually really says, it's important to me and therefore I make it important to my team, or whether most corporate cultures are just effectively machines in the way that they operate?
Well, every organization has a culture. It's whether they recognize it or not, it's there. And it could be it's an overworking, overstressed culture that we do see in some of those sort of city jobs perhaps you're talking about, which of course is a minority of people at work in the UK. Yes, it's a big sector, but the majority of people are working in other sectors. And leadership from the top really helps, certainly. So, if a leader will share their own vulnerability, share their own hopes about what they want to do, then that allows other people too. So it's definitely inspiring when leaders take a lead. We see a lot of bubbling up processes too, as well as top down, where, regional heads or, heads of teams, several teams, they really get this passion that when people enjoy their work, things go better. Senior leaders really should take this more seriously. So there's this great work by a guy called Alex Edmonds. He's a professor at London Business School, who shows that companies with good cultures have 3% extra share price growth each year. So, and I think we instinctively know that. I mean, in the States, you've got things like Southwest Airlines and other ones that really put is it Southwest Airlines that have the really strong culture? I think it is. I'm just remembering off the top of my head, but there's lots of organizations, where they have put culture first and they do have great results. So there is a business case for this. It's totally a win-win situation here, but you do have to unlearn a little bit. And the problem is, as you say, is that some of our leaders at the moment, their first working experience was in the 70s, 80s, or 60s even, and they were slightly oppressed by their culture, and so that's what they know. So it takes that enlightened leader to really start leading with this. But I mean, that's the thing that Friday Pulse, and certainly me personally, wants to push, because I just think it's stupid to have people miserable. You're losing out on their best work.
I hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with Nic Marks, founder of Friday Pulse. Click on the second part of our interview to hear Nic's thoughts on our evolving approach to work.